Australia's public affairs channel.
Now, each of us will, if you look at the history of the Australian, and Paul has given you an erudite account of that this morning, you can see that there were various eras or ages or waves or whatever you want to call them. And it just happens that if we take it chronologically, I'm entitled to kick this off because I was there before these lovely panellists were here. And each of us will give a brief overview of where we came from and the context of our time at the Australian. I joined the Adelaide News as a copy boy in 1960. I stayed in South Australia until 1968. In 1966 I was enormously proud to have my first words appearing in the Australian, because I was then writing politics for the Adelaide News, and the Australian wanted an assessment, a summary, a feature piece on what was happening in South Australia, and asked me to write it. And I thought, wow, a national platform. Wow, this is something very special. I later reported the Mexico Olympics. We had a team of 2 reporters at the 1968 Olympics, covering for the News, the Daily Mirror and the Australian. I think the most recent team was, what, 37 or 38? Vastly different in those days. And, once again, I got that buzz of having my copy appearing daily in the National Daily, and it was very special for a young reporter to be in it. It was very exciting. In 1972, I went to Sydney, and in 1976, I was appointed publisher of the Australian. My job was to repair the damage, the commercial damage that had been done to the publication by the events of the dismissal and the desertion of academia from the readership of the Australian. It was a soul-destroying job, and as publisher, my brief was to range across editorial and the commercial side. And I found the commercial side so difficult that I spent most of my time concentrating on the editorial, which was the part I loved. My era at the Australian, which ended in 1978, was marked by the struggle for existence, as it had been right from day one. There were constant threats of closure. In my period as publisher, we 1 week made a profit. That was the week we had a 32-page defence supplement. We made a profit of $25,000 in a year where we lost $5 million, and that wasn't the worst of it. On the worst year in that era, we lost $8 million. Rupert was under intense pressure internally to close the newspaper, and we were under intense pressure from him to stop the losses. So it was an entertaining period, I can assure you. The Australian entered what you might describe its first period of relative stability under Les Hollings, and Les had 2 stints in the chair. Warren Beeby was made editor in 1980, and he was in between the 2 Hollings editorships. Now, what was the context in your time, Warren?
The context of what particularly?
Well, when you became editor of the Australian, what was the context of the time?
Well, the context of the time was one of industrial and technological chaos. I wish Rupert had given me an undertaking when I took over that the Australian would be there forever, because mine was the period when we had that monumental loss that actually was about 8.5 million, or something like 50 or 60 million in today's money. We were just about a day-to-day proposition in many respects, and unfortunately I regard my editorship mainly as crisis management. I was production editor of the Australian when the computerisation happened on April Fool's Day 1979, and it was truly a fool's day. I think within 2 hours we had our first computer crash, and these happened on a daily basis, and sometimes 4 and 5 times a day, right up until edition time. It was such a joke among the staff that when we'd get the flashing red light that showed that the CPU had collapsed again, someone would ring the computer room and ask how bad was the problem, and they'd get an estimate, and that person would yell out, "It's a 6-schooner break." everyone would take off to the hotel. And this is no exaggeration, I'm afraid. That probably was the catalyst for the great journalist strike of 1980, when it was deemed that computers were such an inhibition to good journalism that the journalists needed I think initially they were after a 20% increase for the hardship of operating technology. And it was hard. In those days, in the early days, we had something like 42 terminals for a staff of 140. And that in itself was a problem because we were competing with the Sydney Morning Herald that had close to 300 people, and our 140 covered interstate and national and foreign. The strike went for 6 weeks, and it was terribly damaging to the Australian because we were unable to bring it out on a daily basis. In those days, the journalists set copy on their dumb terminals, everything going down to the CPU to be processed and sent back, and this produced bromides in the printing room, and the printers pasted it all up. It was very lucky for us that the journalists and the printers very rarely got on any subject, and the journalists sought to get the printers to support them, but failed, and we were able to bring out the Australian only at the weekends. We had to forego the daily editions. After the strike was settled with a 6% disability allowance, it was called, for using computers, there was a brief period of peace in the editorial floors. But then industrial action broke out in earnest, and not only were we having almost daily computer crashes, we were having almost daily stop work meetings, when the journalists at the most crucial times would just walk out of the place and have a chat about how hard it was to bring a newspaper out with faulty equipment, which it was. It was a terrible system. It was replaced about 2 years later by a better system that was still fraught with technical problems. It got to the point where Rupert gave Ken Cowley a brief to close the paper if the industrial action kept on going, and I was with him in the boardroom on the day when he actually said, if they're not back from the stop work meeting, which was in the car park across the street, within 5 minutes I'm closing the paper. And we got a message across the street, and they came back with a few minutes to spare, and that was a shocker.
Could I just, we'll hold it there, plenty of time for further discussion. I didn't ask you, what was your route to the editorial chair? What was your pre-history in journalism?
I started as a copy boy on the Daily Mirror in 1959, aged 16. And I came in with a leaving certificate and was told that I was too old and overeducated. The pattern in those days was to take on people from the intermediate certificate and put them through a 4-year cadetship. Today I think there are still some cadetships given to people from high school, but I think it's almost universally university graduates. I left the Mirror after a couple of years and went to the Sun, specialising in finance and business writing, and came to the Australian in 1966 into the business section. That was when the paper was still in Canberra and I was in the Sydney bureau. And went through various jobs there. A mining writer. We put a lot of emphasis in mining and that sort of coverage. I became business editor of the Sunday Australian in 1970, and then in 1974 I went across to London with Rupert to cover what he believed was going to be the collapse of Britain, and he wanted a specialist business writer there to cover this economic chaos and decline that was happening over there at the time under the Wilson government. Fortuitously, almost the day that I arrived, the British struck oil in the North Sea, and suddenly the economy was on the rise, and Rupert's worst fears didn't come to fruition. From London, I took a monumental switch in direction and went to Canberra as the bureau chief for the News Limited newspapers. Was there through 75 until 78, and then came to Sydney in 78 as leader writer under Les Hollings, and then in pretty swift succession, production editor, deputy editor, and I finally moved on to management in 1972, where I spent the next 25 odd years.
And thank you. We'll come back to Warren. Warren also served for a long period on the Australian Press Council. Now, David Armstrong, welcome. David was the Australian's first homegrown editor, so perhaps you could explain your path from joining to taking over the paper, and then the context of the times when you took over as editor rather than editor-in-chief in, what, 1989?
89. Okay, thank you. You've got to have a bit of luck in this life, and I had a lot of luck in 1969. I was editor of a student newspaper called Tharunka at the University of New South Wales, and there was this new newspaper called The Australian that was trying to get into the university market, and our student union somehow managed to negotiate a deal with John Menadue, who was then the general manager of News Limited, that the Australian should give a little scholarship to the editor of Tharunka. So I got $1,500 a year, and all I had to do at the end was, if I went into journalism, I had to go and approach the Australian first. So, of course, I did, and they gave me a job. They gave me a start. I was actually taken on to start the higher education supplement, but there was a little hitch, and they said it might take a couple of months before you can do this, because they had to persuade the vice chancellors that they should switch the university advertising from Saturday to Wednesday. And I'm not sure exactly when the higher education supplement came into being, but I think it was sometime in the late 70s, so I never had anything to do with it directly. So I started as a general reporter in Sydney from university, and that's why Paul Kelly and I met on his first day, because they thought these two guys who came from university should get to know each other, because there weren't a lot of us. I spent a bit of time in Sydney, a bit of time in Canberra doing general political reporting, came back to Sydney as state political roundsman, and then had a lot of fun in 1975 as the chief editorial writer, finding different ways of saying day by day, Gough must go and Kerr must act. And in due course, both happened. I took part in the strike of 1975, and then I'd resigned anyhow. I left and ended up at the Bulletin. I'm told, I don't know whether it's literally true or just metaphorical, that my papers were marked, never to be employed again. And certainly when, a few years later, when Warren and Brian Boswell asked me to come back to the Australian, it required a change in managing director before I was allowed to take the job from Ken May to Ken Cowley. And Ken Cowley tells me, he said at the time, okay, you can hire Armstrong, but if it all goes bad, it's on your head. Okay. So I spent a couple of years working with Warren, and then with Sir Larry Lamb in his brief time as editor of the Australian. Known far and wide as Sirloin, but to the cognoscenti in the paper he was known as Racker. And that was a terrible time. That included the time that Warren referred to when the paper almost closed, and we had to. There were two conditions. The industrial action had to end. We had to get the costs down dramatically, and had to get the costs down by 25%, which involved sacking about 40 people.
Can you guys speak up?
Yeah, I can't speak up. Sorry, I've got a problem with my throat.
Come forward, ma'am.
This is the other thing that happens on a 7-hour operation. Sorry. Yes. We had to sack 40 people in one go, and on that particular weekend, Larry Lamb went fishing down at Lake Yukonbeam. I had to draw up the hit list, and I said to mental block, the guy who was the general manager at the time,
Ken Cowley.
No.
Oh, Muscat.
No, the other one. Not on the moustache.
Yeah. Frank Shaw. Yeah.
One with a florid face and a moustache. Doesn't matter. I said to him...
That memorable character.
I said, do I have to actually sack these people? And he said, no. He said, you make the bullets and we'll fire them.
Yeah, well, that was Brian Hogben.
Brian Hogben, yes, yeah. That's right. But it was Warren who actually had to do the firing, which is a terrible experience, because he knew who was who. So he was the one who had to go around the room and point out.
But nevertheless, David, that did set the paper on the road to profitability.
Yes, it did. And a couple of years later, Les Hollings got it there. I left the Australian after that. I went to the Bulletin for a while, then back to News Limited, writing political commentaries for the Daily Telegraph, and I was deputy editor of the Daily Telegraph and all set to be editor under a deal we'd arranged. And then suddenly, as a change of heart by the management, I found myself on the Australian as deputy editor to Frank Devine. And Frank had his own issues with the senior management at the time, and by the end of 1989, Frank had been moved on to other things, and I was editor.
What was the political, economic context of those times?
Yeah. Well, the political context generally, I suppose, was we had a Labor government, which the paper had generally supported, certainly at election times. We had one little thing we had to do on the first day, which was there was an election in Queensland the next day, and the opportunity to end so many decades, I forget how many, of National Party rule. So he wrote an editorial advocating the election of a Goss Labor government, which was a little marker to be, as Paul was saying, we're not a paper of one particular party. We got the right at the start. The time was fairly prosperous. I think we kept on in profits, but just around the corner was the recession we had to have, which again was a period of contraction on not a sacking people, sacking a few people. I'm sorry, a period of contraction on the paper, a period of difficulty. But I think we still. Well, not us because we didn't do it, but I think the paper still managed to turn in a profit during that period.
Yeah. Okay, David, thank you. We'll come back there. Now, Michelle Gunn is currently editor of the Weekend Australian, and it's an entirely different era to those days. Well, maybe not entirely different. In my day, it was eternal struggle. What is it now? But you are exposed to the great transition towards digital products, the problems you are living it. So could you talk a bit about your career path to the job?
Sure.
And the context that you see editing at the moment?
Okay, sure. Well, I started on the Australian in 1988. Frank Devine gave me my cadetship on the Australian, and then I worked as a reporter for David. I think David appointed me social affairs writer and then social affairs editor during his stint as editor and editor-in-chief, and obviously then I also worked for Paul. I started in the 80s, worked in Sydney, did a range of, in those days we did do everything at the beginning of our careers, range of reporting jobs. I went to Melbourne, worked in the Melbourne Bureau for 3 or 4 years and came back, and then really stuck to social affairs reporting for a long time, focusing on social policy for the paper. And then 10 or 12 years ago, I moved into managing the Sydney Bureau, so I was Sydney Bureau Chief for 3 or 4 years, then moved to be National Chief of Staff and ran the news desk on the paper, and then Deputy Editor, and then my current job as Editor of the weekend paper I took on in September 2012. So I've spent my whole adult life on the Australian. I started when I was 18, and here I am today. Now you asked me about the transition to digital.
The issues confronting the modern editor, no longer just paper.
No, well that's right, and I think the Australian's path has been an interesting one because, as Paul said earlier on in his address, News Corporation and certainly the Australian still have a very strong commitment to our print product. But now, of course, we just believe in delivering that product across platforms. Unlike some of our competitors, we've always believed that the paper that you are, and you should be across, no matter what the delivery platform. So I think if you find, our readers who read our edition-based app or read us on mobile or indeed on the web are getting very much the same product they get when they purchase the print edition every day. I think that does distinguish us from some of our competitors at the minute. So, look, I think Chris Mitchell has remarked that 90% of our revenue is still in print. So we're not walking away from print in a hurry. However, I do think we're probably market leaders in paid content as well. 2.5 years ago, we went to a paid subscription model. We now have about 65,000 paid subscribers on the Oz, and that's growing. That number is about, if you look at proportionally, it's about half, I think, our peak Monday to Friday circ, which was at about 130. It's now about 110 to 115. So I think those numbers are pretty healthy, and I think we're pretty positive about the future. We love our edition-based iPad. I think the company has a lot of faith, both in terms of reader engagement and also advertising in the tablet, because I think the experience of the UK Times, for example, is that you're getting readers engaging with the content on the iPad for durations of 40 minutes that are comparable to the levels of engagement you get in a newspaper. So I think it's an exciting time to be a newspaper editor, really.
Particularly as nobody knows the outcome.
Well, that's true. We're on a journey, Mark.
But where and when will we get there? It is very interesting. Thank you, Michelle. Now, I have, as Paul mentioned, I've been for the past 18 months or so down a very extensive historical burrow with the Australian, writing the first 25 years for the 50 years in 50 days series, which is coming to an end. Alan Howe has done the second 25 years. And I was reminded when I was doing that, I referred to Dennis Cryle's book on a number of occasions. He wrote the first 25 years of the Australian. I reviewed the book when it was published, and I was rather critical of it because many of the things that he recorded in that book were not the way I remembered them. And on rereading it and using it as a reference for this most recent series, I withdraw much of that criticism because he did an extraordinarily good job to get to the core of what was happening, even though in detail I do take issue with some minor aspects. But listening to Paul this morning talking about the great sweep of history, you forget the little ripples that occur on a day-to-day basis. And I remember my period as publisher and later editor-in-chief very much as dealing with the issues of the day rather than sitting there staring out the window and saying, where shall we go in the broad sweep of history? Sure, you've always got in the back of your mind that you're editing a product for a particular market, and that market was clearly understood and, as Paul did today, clearly defined. But not every day do the stories you're dealing with have anything to do with that. And in my period, I found that the greatest difficulty was to get a polished, balanced product on a daily basis. It involved dealing with a lot of individuals and a lot of individual stories, and I did not have my eyes firmly fixed on the horizon. I had my eyes firmly fixed about where my next step was. Now, I say that to introduce the panel again, to ask how you saw your role as the editor, both conceptually and in practice. Warren.
Well, I think I saw it pretty much the way that you did, that as I explained, technical and industrial issues were dominating things on a daily basis, but we covered that wide spectrum of stories from courts, you know, through state parliaments and industrially and arts features. We were always very strong and focused on the arts. We liked food. We did a lot of food things back in those days. Higher education supplement was a priority, as was the technology section, which in those days was called computers, and that was largely the financial driver of the paper. Even then, but more so as years went on and the paper plunged into profit. Unfortunately, I thought management took its eye off the technology section and allowed the internet to eat its breakfast. So that guaranteed financial stream that supported the paper for so long was lost. But it was largely day-to-day issues. During my editorship, Malcolm Fraser was in the early stages of his prime ministership, and it's safe to say the paper was still at that stage largely supportive of him. I think that just about covers that.
David?
Yeah. You don't sit there worrying about the fate of the world every 5 minutes. You're right. It is a daily struggle. However, I was having worked on the Bulletin and the Australian, and the Bulletin was very active in the early 80s on the question of making Australia a more competitive, more open economy. I was very conscious of that stream of the Australian's editorial stance. Making a more open nation generally, as